Whoa, 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 hold on. Did you just walk into a billionaire security tryout with a child? Bro thought this was a field trip. Where's her lunchbox, man?
The man they laughed at walked in carrying a 4-year-old girl and a stuffed bear with one eye missing. 58 candidates stood in the lobby of the Kestrel Tower wearing pressed suits and polished shoes. Every one of them had a folder. Every one of them had a story about how dangerous they were. Then the glass door swung open, and Caleb Morrow walked in. Wrinkled blue shirt, scuffed boots, a little girl on his hip with her face pressed against his neck like she was still half asleep. The bear dangled from her fist by one chewed ear. The laughter started before he reached the front desk. Someone in the third row said it loud enough to carry. Bro thought this was a field trip. More laughter. The kind that builds because people feel safe inside it. Caleb didn't turn around. He set the girl down, fixed the collar on her jacket with 2 fingers, and walked toward the registration table like the room behind him didn't exist. 18 seconds later, Darius Webb, 240 pounds of professional fighting record, was face down on the mat with his arm locked behind him at an angle that made 3 people in the room look away. Nobody laughed after that. Not even Ava Brennan, who had moved close enough to see everything, standing still at the edge of the training floor while something shifted inside her chest that she wasn't prepared to name. The Kestrel Group occupied the top 20 floors of its building in downtown Atlanta. Security software, government contracts, private client protection architecture. The kind of company that didn't advertise what it actually did. The lobby that Monday morning had been converted into a staging floor. 58 candidates, each one hand-selected, each one arriving with the posture of a man who had already decided he was the answer. Ex-military contractors, professional fighters, former federal agents with laminated resumes and the quiet aggression of people paid for years to look unmovable. The air smelled like ambition and dry-clean suits. Then Caleb Morrow walked in. Brendan Holt moved across the lobby before the clerk finished reaching for her tablet. Brendan was 36, wide through the chest, with the particular confidence of someone who had already written the ending of today in his head. As acting head of security for Kestrel, he had reasons to be threatened by this tryout, and he had chosen to convert that threat into performance. He stopped directly in front of Caleb, close enough to make the size difference obvious. "This a custody hearing or a job interview?" Brendan said. The room gave him what he was looking for. Darius Webb, sitting in the front row with one leg stretched out and his arms crossed, gave a slow nod. 3 regional MMA titles, 14 professional fights, 0 losses in the last 2 years. He had enjoyed the morning so far. Caleb looked at Brendan once. "My name's on your list," he said. 9 o'clock. Brendan picked up the tablet. Something crossed his face for half a second. Something he buried quickly. The name Caleb Morrow sat at the very top of the candidate roster. Added Sunday evening. Added personally by Ava Brennan, CEO of the Kestrel Group. Brendan handed the tablet back without a word and gestured toward the main hall with his chin. The little girl, Nora, was walked to a small waiting area near the reception desk where a junior staff member had set up coloring sheets and a low table. She sat down, placed the bear on the chair beside her, opened to a blank page, and began drawing without asking anyone anything. Caleb walked onto the floor. The first round was not about strength. Each candidate stood at a desk for 3 minutes. 1 interviewer. 5 situational questions. No preparation. The men before Caleb arrived with printed service records, laminated credentials, and photographs of themselves with notable clients. 1 man brought a 12-page portfolio. 2 of them opened with the phrase, "In my 15 years of experience." Caleb came to the desk with nothing in his hands. The interviewer looked up. "Your materials?" Caleb placed a single sheet of white paper on the desk. 1 phone number. 1 sentence beneath it. "Call this if you need to know who I am." Brendan Holt, standing 4 feet away with his arms crossed, exhaled through his nose. The sound of deliberate patience. "You're serious?" "Very," Caleb said. The second part of the round was a response assessment. Each candidate watched a 90-second video. A crowded event space, multiple actors in frame, a principal figure in the foreground, then had 30 seconds to identify threat positions and propose a protocol. Darius watched the video, paused, and identified 4 of the 6 marked positions. He spoke clearly. The room approved. Caleb watched it once. He stood with his arms at his sides. 6 marked positions, he said. 2 unmarked. The camera dead zone behind the pillar on the left gives a 4-foot unobserved approach angle. The man in the gray hoodie has repositioned his hands 3 times since the clip started. He's carrying something he hasn't decided whether to use yet. 2 seconds of silence. Lucky red, Brendan said. Caleb returned to his seat without answering. On the 31st floor, Ava Brennan was watching the feed on the monitor above her desk. She sat with a notepad on her knee she hadn't written in for 22 minutes. Her assistant, Jordan Mills, stood near the door. He doesn't fit the profile, Jordan said carefully. No, Ava said. He doesn't. 3 weeks earlier, an unmarked envelope had arrived on Ava's desk. Inside was an 11-page document. Service record. Skills assessment. Personal profile on one Caleb Morrow. No sender. No return address. At the bottom of the last page, one typed sentence. She's going to need him. Ava had traced the number attached to the document. She had not received a name back yet. On the monitor, Caleb sat in his chair with the same expression he'd had since walking in. Not bored. Not auditioning patience. Simply present. The way someone is present when they have nothing left to prove to anyone in the room. Ava tapped her pen against the notepad once. Then she set it down. When the physical round bracket posted on the board, the room read it with the focused attention of men who understood the stakes. Most matchups were balanced. One wasn't. Brendan Holt had personally arranged the bracket that morning. He had placed Caleb Morrow against Darius Webb with the quiet satisfaction of someone removing a problem before it becomes inconvenient. If this quiet, unpedigreed, single-father anomaly who had appeared out of nowhere on the CEO's personal list could be eliminated in the first physical round, the whole situation resolved itself cleanly. Darius read his name on the bracket and smiled. Not a cruel smile. He didn't need cruelty. He simply didn't experience this as a contest. The other candidates drifted toward the outer edge of the mat. Phones came out. The mood had shifted into something between sport and foregone conclusion. They were going to watch the big man close the parenthesis on this strange morning, and then the day would make sense again. Upstairs, Jordan leaned toward the monitor. Ava. They put him against Webb. Ava was already standing. She straightened her jacket and walked to the door. You're going down? Jordan asked. The screen is too small, Ava said. She arrived at the training floor without announcement. The moment she appeared in the doorway, the room reorganized itself. Postures straightened. Conversations stopped mid-breath. Brendan moved toward her immediately. Ms. Brennan, there's no need to. Continue, she said, looking past him toward the mat. She didn't look at Darius Webb. She had already assessed Darius. He was exactly what he appeared to be. Powerful, credentialed, completely readable. She looked at Caleb. He was crouched at the edge of the mat, readying the lace on his left boot. He was not looking at Darius. He was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at her. In 11 years as CEO of Kestrel, Ava Brennan had sat across from hundreds of people who were working very hard to make an impression on her. Caleb Morrow appeared to have either no awareness that she was worth impressing, or had decided it was simply irrelevant to his current task. That single fact held her attention more than anything else she had seen all morning. Darius stepped onto the mat and looked down at Caleb with something approaching generosity. You don't have to do this, man. Nobody's gonna judge you. A low wave of approval moved through the room. Caleb finished tying his lace. He stood up, stepped onto the mat, and faced the center of it with the stillness of a man who had already decided what was about to happen and found the decision unremarkable. In the waiting area down the hall, Nora had stopped drawing. She was watching through the narrow window. The young staff member beside her glanced between the girl and the mat. Is your dad good at this? She asked. Nora held the bear tighter. He doesn't lose, she said. But he never talks about it. The timer started. Darius came forward immediately. No hesitation. Same sequence he had used all morning. Close the distance. Establish grip. Control weight. It had ended 4 matches before 10 o'clock. He applied it now with the calm of a man repeating a proven formula. Caleb moved back. Not scrambling. 1 precise step. His weight shifted to the outside edge of his left foot in a way that redirected Darius's approach angle by a fraction. Barely visible. Barely anything. Darius's grip closed on air instead of shoulder. The room didn't understand what had happened. Darius recovered and came again. And again. By the 9th second, Ava had stopped breathing at her normal rhythm. She was watching Caleb's eyes. They weren't tracking the way a fighter's eyes tracked, following motion, reacting to threat. They were still, focused on something deeper than individual movement, something below the surface of what was happening. Caleb gave Darius something on each exchange, a fraction of an opening, a half step of apparent vulnerability. Each time, the follow-through found nothing there. Ava's hand found the door frame without her noticing. At the 17th second, Caleb's eyes changed. A small contraction. Almost nothing. He had seen what he needed to see. He had spent 16 seconds not fighting Darius Webb. He had spent 16 seconds learning him. At the 18th second, Caleb stepped in instead of back. What followed happened too fast for most of the room to process cleanly. One arm controlled the elbow at the joint. The other made a small, decisive adjustment to Darius's center of gravity. Not a throw in any traditional sense. A redirection so precise that Darius's own momentum became the mechanism of his fall. The technique wasn't MMA. It wasn't boxing. It wasn't anything the room could name. Darius Webb hit the mat face down and didn't move. Total time, 24 seconds. No one spoke. Caleb released his hold, stepped back, and stood upright. His breathing was unchanged. He turned his hands over once. Mechanical check, nothing more, and stepped off the mat. Brendan Holt was holding a clipboard. He didn't seem aware it had fallen from his hand until it made a flat sound against the floor. The phones that had been raised to capture a short, decisive humiliation were still recording. Nobody had thought to stop them. Nora appeared at the doorway, having slid from her chair the moment she heard silence instead of noise. She crossed the floor to her father with the focused urgency of a small child on a mission. "Dad, are you done?" Caleb crouched down to her level. He looked at her face with the careful attention he gave to everything. "All done. Can we get a snack? What do you want?" She thought about this with complete seriousness. "Goldfish. The rainbow kind." "Done," he said. He stood, took her hand, and walked toward the hall exit. Behind him, Darius Webb was being helped to his feet by 2 other candidates doing their best to look unsurprised. Ava Brennan stood at the door. Her hand dropped from the frame. She turned and walked back to the elevator without a word. Jordan fell into step beside her, and for the length of the corridor, neither of them said anything. Then Jordan said, very quietly, "His breathing didn't change." "I know," Ava said. She pressed the elevator button. The doors opened. She stepped in. And somewhere between the lobby and the 31st floor, she acknowledged to herself, as a private and purely operational observation, that she had not looked at a single other person in that room for the last 8 minutes. She called him up before the bracket finished. The 31st floor was quiet the way expensive buildings were quiet. Not silent, deliberately undisturbed. Ava's office occupied the northeast corner with floor-to-ceiling windows that returned the city in clean rectangular sections. Books organized by spine color. Her desk held exactly 3 things: a monitor, a notepad, a glass of water. Nora stepped inside, stopped, and looked around with the evaluative focus of a child who took spaces seriously. "It's really clean in here," she said, "but there's nothing fun to look at." Ava, who had been watching Caleb from behind her desk, looked at the girl. A beat passed. "I know," she said. She slid a folder across the desk. "Sit down." He sat. Nora settled into the chair beside him, pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket, and began drawing without being asked. Ava asked about the technique on the mat. He said it came from specific training in specific environments. He didn't elaborate. She asked about his service record. He said it was in the folder she had already reviewed. She asked who sent her the 11-page document with his name on it. He looked at the folder on her desk. For 2 seconds, something moved behind his eyes. Recognition, calculation, then a deliberate settling. I don't know, he said. She watched him. He was telling the truth. That was the part that bothered her most. She signed the contract without renegotiating. Downstairs, Brendan Holt received the news on his phone. He stood in the corridor outside the main hall, stared at the screen for a long moment, and then called a number that didn't appear in Kestrel's company directory. The call lasted 38 seconds. Afterward, he smoothed the front of his jacket and went back inside to finish the tryout as though nothing had happened. The first week, Caleb worked like he didn't exist. Exactly 1 step behind Ava. Not 2. Not beside her. 1 step. He knew which conference room doors ran on delayed hinges before he reached them. He read meeting spaces before she entered them. A half-second pause at the threshold. Eyes moving once across the room. He knew when someone was carrying tension before the conversation surfaced it. In 11 years of running Kestrel, Ava had never had a security detail she forgot was there because it simply functioned that naturally. She also noticed that he didn't look at her the way people usually looked at her. The particular performance energy of someone aware they were standing near a CEO, that low-grade voltage, the subtle over-positioning of the body toward power, was completely absent in him. He wasn't positioned toward her because she was important. He was positioned toward her because she was his responsibility. The distinction was so unfamiliar that it took her 3 days to name it. On the 5th day, Nora's afternoon sitter canceled. Caleb came to Ava's office door and spoke briefly to Jordan, who came in and framed it as a logistical issue requiring his absence for the afternoon. Ava said, "Bring her here." Jordan paused. Ava had already turned back to her screen. Nora arrived 40 minutes later with her backpack and her drawing supplies. She said hello to Ava, placed the bear on the corner of the waiting room couch, sat down, and worked quietly for the entire afternoon without a single interruption. At 4:30, she walked to Ava's open office door and held out a folded piece of paper. Ava opened it. 3 crayon figures in front of a house. 1 tall figure in a dark jacket. 1 figure with straight hair and a gray dress. 1 small figure holding something white and round with 1 dark dot for an eye. In front of the house, a tree. Green leaves. Yellow sky. Ava looked at it for a long time. She folded it carefully, placed it inside the top left drawer of her desk. Not the recycling bin. The drawer. That evening, an anonymous email arrived on Ava's personal account. 9 words in the body. You're being sold and you don't know it yet. Attached was a screenshot of a clause from a merger framework agreement she had signed 7 months earlier with Praxis Holdings, led by a man named Grant Fowler. The clause had a small marker at the bottom. Section 11. She called her legal team. Her primary contract attorney didn't answer. His associate called back 40 minutes later with an explanation that felt carefully constructed. Ava sat at her desk after the call and stared at the wall. Caleb was standing near the window. He had been there since she finished. "Do you know anything about this?" she said. "Not enough yet," he said. "But I'm looking." Dinner with Grant Fowler was arranged for Thursday at a restaurant on the 38th floor of the Meridian Hotel. The kind of place where the lighting was designed to make powerful people look comfortable. Fowler was 61. Polished. The particular benevolence of a man who had learned that appearing harmless was a more effective strategy than appearing strong. He stood when Ava arrived, expressed genuine-sounding pleasure, and ordered a wine that cost more than most people's rent. He acknowledged Caleb with a brief look, the look of a man who had completed an accurate assessment and found it worth filing. The meal moved through its early stages like theater. Fowler used words like alignment and shared vision without embarrassment. He mentioned 3 of Ava's initiatives by name in ways that showed he had done his research. Then, during the main course, he dropped it casually. The Q4 benchmarks will, of course, be the natural inflection point, given Section 11. Ava set her fork down with the careful motion of someone who does not permit their hands to express what their face will not. Inside, something dropped. "Of course," she said. Fowler smiled with the warmth of a man who believed he had already won. "I want to be clear, Ava. I'm not your adversary. I'm simply practical." She looked at him. "I appreciate that, Grant." In the car afterward, the city moved past the windows in white and amber streaks. Caleb drove. Neither of them spoke for 20 minutes. Then Ava said, "Did you read the contract before you took this job?" "First morning," Caleb said. Section 11. Section 15. Appendix D. A pause. She looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror. "Why would you read my contracts? Can't protect you if I don't understand the ground you're standing on." She watched him in the mirror. He was watching the road. His jaw had a line of tension in it that hadn't been there during dinner, which meant he had been performing calm in that restaurant the same way she had. And she hadn't seen it until now. That realization settled into her chest and stayed there. 3 nights later, the security log for Kestrel's basement parking level showed a 9-minute gap. No footage. No error code explaining the absence. Just the gap. Technically impossible under the current system unless someone had created it. Someone who understood the system well enough to edit it from the inside. Caleb found it during his end-of-day review. He didn't report it immediately. He copied the log, closed the original, and sat for a long time in the second-floor security office looking at that 9-minute window. He had spent 5 years in a unit that specialized in identifying internal network compromises. Situations where the threat wasn't external, it was living inside a trusted structure. He knew what the early architecture of a betrayal looked like. He was looking at it now. Brendan Holt had access to the camera system. Brendan Holt had a number in his contacts that didn't belong to Kestrel. And Brendan Holt had been in the building during those 9 minutes. Caleb closed his laptop and began building a different kind of record. The conversation about Mia happened on the 12th night. Nora had started coughing around 3 in the afternoon. Nothing alarming. But by 6 she had a low fever and the particular expression of a child managing discomfort with slightly too much determination. Caleb came to Ava's office at 6:15 and asked, with the economy of words that defined him, whether he could leave at 7 instead of 8. Ava stood up and got her coat. He looked at her. "You don't have to," he said. "I know," she said. His apartment was on the 12th floor of a building 11 blocks north. Clean. Small. Almost nothing in it that wasn't functional, except for one corner of the living room that belonged entirely to Nora. Drawings covered the wall in a dense, overlapping gallery. Books stacked in bright columns by height. A low basket held stuffed animals in some arrangement that appeared to have its own internal logic. Ava sat on the edge of Nora's bed while Caleb went to make soup in the kitchen. Nora looked up from the pillow with the evaluative calm of a child deciding whether this visitor was worth her assessment. "Do you have a family?" Nora asked. "My mom," Ava said. "We don't see each other much." Nora considered this like a judge reviewing new evidence. "My dad's always busy," she said. "But he's always here." Later, after Nora was asleep and the bowls had been rinsed, they sat at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. The building made its evening sounds. The city pressed its light against the window. Ava asked about Nora's mother. Caleb was quiet long enough that she wondered if she had crossed a line. Then he turned the cup once in his hands and said that her name was Mia, that she had been killed in a car accident 4 years ago when Nora was 2, that he had been on a mission when the call came, that he had been on a transport home within 8 hours and out of service within 90 days, that he had not gone back. He said all of it the way he said most things, directly, without asking for a particular response. Ava didn't offer sympathy in the standard arrangement of words. She sat with it for a moment and then said, "Is that why you always stay exactly 1 step back?" He looked at her. For the first time since she had known him, the expression on his face was not the expression of a person doing a job. It was something older, less defended. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. In the morning, she called the investigator she had retained separately, the one no one at Kestrel knew about. She gave the investigator the phone number from Caleb's original single sheet of white paper. The result came back within hours. The number belonged to a retired brigadier general named Roy Stanton, who had commanded Caleb's unit during the last 3 years of his service. Stanton was the one who had sent the 11-page document. Stanton knew about Fowler. Stanton had known for longer than she had. Ava read the name in the report and sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she said to herself, in the empty office, "I've been surrounded, and I didn't see it." The emergency shareholder session arrived on a Tuesday. Grant Fowler had called it with the formal language of process. A performance review, a routine Q4 alignment conversation. Dominic had been tracking peripheral activity for 10 days by then. What Caleb saw in the 48 hours before the meeting was not consistent with routine anything. 2 service elevators had been accessed after hours using maintenance badges that hadn't been checked out through the standard system. 3 external visitors had been registered under a consulting firm name that didn't appear in Kestrel's vendor database. And Monday evening, the motion sensors on the 31st floor logged a 7-second anomaly in the eastern corridor, 7 seconds during which they detected presence, then stopped detecting it. Which meant they had been overridden, not fooled. Caleb built the picture piece by piece on the security office screen. Someone was planning to access Kestrel's central server during the shareholder session, when every decision-maker in the company would be in one room, focused on one problem, facing one direction. The server held client data across 800 corporate accounts. In the wrong hands, in the hours before a forced leadership transition, it was worth more than the merger itself. He had 35 minutes. He moved through the building the way he had been trained to move. Not running, not conspicuous, with the particular efficiency of someone who has committed to a route entirely. He cleared the lower floors, secured the boardroom, placed Jordan at Ava's side, and reached the 31st floor via the rear fire stairwell. They were already there. 4 of them, professional, unhurried, moving toward the server room with the confidence of people who had been told the floor would be clear. It was not clear. What followed was not a long fight. Long fights happened when there was uncertainty about the outcome. Caleb had spent years removing uncertainty as efficiently as possible. The first 2 were controlled and immobilized before the third finished processing what was happening. The third came from the left. He had anticipated the angle the moment he identified the team's formation. The fourth, the largest, lasted 11 seconds. Then Brendan Holt stepped out of the eastern corridor with a firearm and the flat expression of a man who had arrived at the part he had been rehearsing. "I need 12 minutes, Brendan said. "Stand down and nobody gets hurt." Caleb looked at him. His left shoulder had taken a hit in the last exchange. Nothing structural. He filed it and moved on. "I don't have 12 minutes, he said. The confrontation was brief. Brendan was skilled and committed, but he was operating on the logic of threat. Caleb was operating on the logic of necessity. Necessity has a particular advantage in close quarters. When the building security team arrived via the fire stairs 2 minutes later, Brendan Holt was seated against the wall, hands immobilized, wearing the specific expression of a man who had bet on the wrong outcome and knew it. Downstairs in the boardroom, Ava sat at the head of the table with 28 shareholders and 1 Grant Fowler arranged in front of her. She had received the update from Jordan 60 seconds earlier through an earpiece. She had absorbed it, processed it, and returned her face to its baseline. Fowler had been speaking. She let him finish his sentence. Then she said, "This session will need to be postponed. Law enforcement will explain the reasons within the next few minutes." She let 1 beat pass. Then she looked at Fowler with the direct focus of someone who had finished being diplomatic. Section 11 will also be contested under Clause 19b, which provides for nullification in cases of documented partner fraud. "I have the documentation." Fowler sat very still. "I've been building the file," she said. "For 9 days. The hospital was not where Caleb had planned to end his Tuesday. He declined the first ambulance. Ava met him in the Kestrel lobby as the police were completing their initial processing of the scene. She looked at his left shoulder and the state of his shirt and said simply, "I'm driving." He started to say something. She held up her keys. At the emergency intake desk, she gave his name and insurance information from memory. She had reviewed all personnel files the weekend after his hiring, a fact she had not mentioned to him. In the exam room, while they waited for the attending physician, Ava took gauze from the supply shelf and began working on the cut on his forearm. She did this without asking. He found that notable. "You know how to do this?" he said. "No," she said, "but I learn fast." He watched her work and didn't say anything further. Nora arrived 25 minutes later with Jordan, who had called the sitter and then driven over when the sitter didn't answer. The girl came through the door with the bear under one arm and covered the distance to her father's bed in 4 steps. She held his hand for a moment without speaking. That told him more about the drive over than any words would have. Then Nora looked at Ava with the careful assessment she applied to questions that mattered. "Is Miss Brennan why Dad got hurt?" Caleb said. "No. Dad got hurt because of what his job needed him to do." Nora considered this. The reasoning was acceptable. She turned back to Ava, and whatever she found in the woman's face appeared to settle something she hadn't asked aloud. "Can you stay?" Nora said. "I don't want him to be alone when he's hurt." Ava looked at Caleb. He was studying the wall above the bed with the focused attention of a man who had decided to examine the paint very carefully. She pulled the chair beside the bed closer and sat down. "Okay," she said. By 11 at night, the corridor was mostly quiet. Nora was asleep on the waiting room bench across the hall, her head resting on Ava's jacket. The bear fitted into the space between her chin and chest. Ava sat without moving, one hand resting lightly near the girl's shoulder. Caleb stood at the doorway of the exam room, cleared for discharge but not yet gone. His shoulder had been properly dressed. He was wearing a clean shirt Jordan had retrieved from the apartment. He stood in the doorway and watched the two of them in the yellow corridor light and didn't speak for a long time. Ava looked up. Neither of them said anything. The city ran its usual sounds outside the window at the end of the hall. Sirens at a distance. The low harmonic of traffic. The anonymous noise of a place that didn't slow down for ordinary emergencies. Caleb walked back in and sat on the edge of the bench on the other side of Nora, so the girl lay between them with the bear occupying the center. After a while, Ava said quietly, "She added to the drawing." He waited. "The one she gave me last week. I had it on my desk. She came in this morning before I arrived and added something." "What did she add?" "A door," Ava said. "She drew a door on the house, and a welcome mat in front of it." Caleb was quiet. The corridor light made its low, even hum above them. Nora breathed in the slow rhythm of a child who trusted entirely, without condition, that the world around her was held. For the first time in that long and breaking day, for the first time perhaps in a good deal longer than that, the corner of Caleb Morrow's mouth moved. Small, quiet, unmistakably a beginning. And somewhere in the top left drawer of Ava Brennan's desk, a crayon drawing of 3 figures stood in front of a house with a door, and a welcome mat, and a tree with green leaves, and a sky that had been colored yellow. Because Nora Morrow, age 4, with one-eyed bear and complete certainty, had already decided how the story ended, long before either of the adults had figured out they were in one.